Hello, welcome to Educators on Education, a Study.com webinar series. We are delighted to have you. Before we dig into intros, please tell us a bit about yourself by completing the poll on your screen. Also, we have a large group on the line. We have attendees muted. That said, any questions you have, please navigate to the Q&A tab and our team will be monitoring inquiries there. We'll also do a formal Q&A at the end. For those of you who have joined us in previous webinars, welcome back. If this is your first time here, welcome. I am Charlotte Payton, a partnership manager with Study.com. I'm also a former high school teacher and have been supporting schools, teachers, and students in EdTech since 2016. I would like to welcome Dr. Ashley Bruckbauer to Educators on Education. Dr. Brockbauer's background is in designing educational programs and resources for a broad range of audiences. As a teacher and scholar, Dr. Brockbauer has engaged and empowered diverse groups through various channels and across multiple formats, including university courses, museum exhibitions, public lectures, and scholarly publications. Her dedication to making education more accessible led her to her current role at Study.com, where she focuses on content design and specializes in the science behind microlearning. We're hosting this webinar on the science behind microlearning because it is the cornerstone to Study.com. Today we will learn more about the science of microlearning and why it is such a powerful tool. But first, Dr. Brockbauer, tell us what drew you to Study.com.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So prior to coming to Study, I worked for about a decade in higher education, where I was both a researcher and an instructor. And during this time, I was earning my PhD, which involved conducting research, doing a lot of writing and publishing, but I was also teaching art history to undergraduate students. And I did that both in person and online. And really teaching is what drew me in to the profession and what made me, want to get a PhD. I loved educating, thought that I wanted to work in higher ed for the rest of my career, and was really interested in pedagogy. So during my time teaching as an instructor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I was devoted to making my classes really accessible to students. So taking concepts that were maybe very complex or intimidating and trying to break them down to something clear and approachable for students. I was also interested in helping them to be more active participants in their learning process and learn how to translate the skills and the knowledge they were learning in my classroom into their own real life context, whether that was visiting a museum and analyzing works of art, or also just being able to talk sort of in a knowledgeable way about art with their friends and family. So that brought me to Study in a few ways and really made the company a natural fit. One of the things was that I was very much drawn to Study's mission of making education accessible, which was something that I had also been interested in my previous career. Two, I wanted to make online education in particular more engaging and efficacious. I had had some, not perfect experiences, both as a learner in an online environment and as a teacher in an online environment. So just wanting to make better experiences overall. And then finally, I'm really wanting to make a broader impact. So usually I would teach maybe 40 students a semester. When I was working in museums, I might teach, a few hundred, maybe 1,000, but Study.com is reaching millions of learners every month. And so just knowing the scale of that impact really drew me in.
Such similar reasons for my move to Study.com as well. As we move into a deeper discussion of microlearning, please complete the poll on your screen. What are you looking forward to learning about today? So, Dr. Brockbauer, can you help educators understand what microlearning is and why it is the backbone of what we do here at Study.com? What is the science behind microlearning?
Yeah, absolutely. So microlearning is really a catch-all term for any learning that is bite-sized in form, and the experience can take a lot of different modalities. So it could be something like a text lesson, maybe that's 500 words focused on a particular topic. It could be a video learning experience, maybe around 5 minutes, walking someone through how to perform a particular task or process, like those how-to videos that you might see online. Or it could be a multimedia interactive learning experience that has text, images, ways to kind of get you engaged, and maybe scenario-based learning that takes probably less than about 10 minutes. So really it is this sort of catch-all. In terms of the science behind microlearning, it's based on a theoretical framework in educational psychology known as cognitivism. And cognitivism essentially studies the way that we think, but in particular, the way that we process information. So thinking about from when we first encounter information, the attention that we pay to it, how we understand it, and then how we put it into our memories and retrieve it later. So cognitivism essentially says that our brain works a lot like a computer, that we receive information, we encode it, we put it into working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, depending on kind of that level of engagement with the information, and then eventually we retrieve it. How this relates to microlearning is really through two particular theories that sit within cognitivism. The first is cognitive load theory, and the second is spaced learning theory. So the first one is really about the amount of information that we're receiving at any given time, and the second is about the pace of how that information is delivered. I like to think of these together as ensuring that we're not doing too much too fast. So to dig into each of them a little bit, cognitive load theory essentially states that our brain can only handle a limited amount of information at a time, right, or inputs. If we exceed that amount, we're going to become overloaded, overwhelmed, and confused. So think about if you've ever been thrown into kind of a new environment where you need to absorb a lot of information at a time. It's really easy to kind of experience what we call cognitive overwhelm, where you don't know where to start. It's hard to remember anything because it's all so new. And this is really because our working memory, which is what we use for new information, is quite limited. We can maybe hold 3 to 4 pieces of new information in our working memory at a time. Think about if you have a to-do list and you're saying, okay, I know that I need to remember at the grocery store, I need to get apples, I need to get oranges, I need to get coffee, and I need to get frozen pizza, let's say. Holding those 4 things in your memory, you might be able to do it, but the best way is going to be for you to find some kind of mnemonic device to remember it. So if you can only remember sort of one thing, and then you can allow that to help you remember the 4 things that you need to get, right? Same thing if you're trying to remember like a long string of random numbers. We might be able to remember 4 to 5 digits. If we repeat a number to ourselves over and over enough times, we might be able to hold it in our memory today. Tomorrow, would we know that same phone number? Probably not. And so that's really what cognitive load theory is it's saying there's only a limited amount of new information we can hold in our working memory. How this relates to microlearning is essentially that we need to approach new information really in small bite-sized chunks. And that's exactly what a micro lesson is. It's giving us just enough new information at a time so that we're not overloaded. And it's even better if we can take that new information, connect it to existing information, group it maybe with similar information that we already know. So through something like chunking, right? And if we can be exposed to it multiple times. So kind of like repeating that phone number over and over again. If you dial your mom's phone number enough times, eventually it's going to make its way into that long-term memory. So that's really the first theory that microlearning is supported by. The second one is that spaced learning theory. So this essentially states that we retain information best when we're exposed to it in a series of short bursts rather than one long unbroken period. So I think teachers will really resonate with this. We often tell our students, don't cram. Don't wait until the end of the unit to try to learn everything in the unit. Same thing, don't wait till the end of the semester to try to learn everything for the final exam. You need to pace your studying out over time. And the reason for this is not just because of our working memory and its limits, but also because our brains need time to sit with information so that they can encode it. And that encoding is really organizing information within our current framework So essentially think of our brains like a library. We have books on the shelves already. We need to know where on the shelves should the new information go. And that takes time to basically find a shelf for it, put it there, and be able to retrieve it later. So things like sleeping, eating, taking a break are all really good for helping us to remember down the line. And it's why sometimes when we hit a brick wall with learning and then we go and we revisit the next day, we have a breakthrough, we have an epiphany. Even, yeah, if you think about like a personal project that you're struggling with, just having that break really helps our brains kind of rest and be able to see it with new eyes. And so again, micro-learning supports this because it really puts in natural pauses or breaks because the chunks of learning are so small and can be spread out over time.
So how do the knowledge checks or the quizzes that are at the end of every micro-learning lesson, how does it support that process?
Yeah, I would say in a couple ways. I think one is that spaced repetition, just by seeing something again, maybe in the format of a question, even sort of like a multiple choice, if it's through recognition, you're getting that information more than once. So that's definitely helpful. Also, it's helping you to apply what you've learned. So it could be recognizing information that you've learned. It could be retrieving it if it's something like a fill in the blank, or it could be applying if it's like a scenario or an activity that you're doing. So yeah, those knowledge checks definitely help sort of reinforce what you've learned.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that very thorough explanation. So our micro lessons break down information. You've alluded to that into chunks, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that in a second. And we have on the screen just a little snapshot of what that micro lesson might look like. So micro learning has been part of the pedagogy for the last decade. What makes Study.com's approach unique?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there's a few things that make Study unique in its approach to microlearning. The first is that all Study.com microlearning is contextualized. And what I mean by that is that our micro lessons are situated within larger chapters and courses. And this is going to easily allow teachers to chunk information, right, to connect or link lessons together so that students can see essentially the connections between previous things that they've learned and the new thing that they're learning. So a lot of micro learning, especially in like professional development context, tends to be decontextualized. Think of something like a sexual harassment training you might have to do when you're onboarded. Usually that's completely outside of the context of when you might need to retrieve or use that information. It's not necessarily linked to other parts of your onboarding experience. And so Study.com, by having our micro learning all sort of linked together within a course that you can use it that way, but you don't have to, is providing that context for students and for teachers. Another way that our microlearning is unique is that it's very granular. And so this might seem obvious because these are short lessons, but they're focused on very specific topics. And that's certainly not always the case with microlearning. Sometimes topics can be very broad. It can be, get a digest of all of American art history in 10 minutes. It's a lot to take in, even if it is small and bite-sized, but our microlearning tends to be much more specific and focused. And the great thing about this, I think, for teachers is it can allow you to differentiate and target learning of specific concepts, specific skills that your students need to learn and master, but maybe that they're struggling with, right? So maybe they understand the broader part of differential equations, but they need to learn how to study a particular type of differential equation that they just can't really get over. They can't get over that hump of learning. So it allows you to have that sort of targeted learning, targeted practice. And then the third way I'd say that we're unique is that our microlearning is very modular. So it allows a huge amount of flexibility just in terms of how teachers want to use it. So you can mix and match, take what you want, leave what you don't. Use the microlearning lessons sort of independently, use them as part of a larger lesson. It can be basically the core part of what you're doing, or it can be a supplement. It's really up to you.
Awesome. And yeah, as a teacher, all of this speaks to me, especially, trying to target a specific idea for one student or a group of students and knowing that they need that support. So how do you, that takes me to my next question, which is how do you envision educators using Study.com and its micro lessons in their day-to-day teaching?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of different ways that teachers can use it. Like I said, because it is modular, it allows a ton of flexibility. Two ways that I would call out. One is as a primer for students. So it could be something like pre-work if you're doing a flipped classroom and maybe you want to have a student look over a micro-learning lesson, watch a video in advance to essentially just prepare them and prime them for the subject that you're going to be covering that day in class. It could also be done during class. If you don't want to do it asynchronously, you could do it synchronously as a warm-up activity. So having a video that they watch as they come in, having sort of a bell ringer, maybe have a practice question or two on the board for them to work through. And this is really going to help maybe get your students excited, get them engaged, get them focused, right, for the day. Always want to do that. And then you can dig deeper in class. I think another part of this, using these lessons as a primer that's good, is they can really hit on those lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, so that remember and understand level, which frees up your time to focus on the application, the evaluation, and the creation skills that are at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. The other way I would say that the microlearning can be used is as a supplement. So this could be either as remediation or as enrichment, just depending on the needs of your students. So you could assign a particular lesson or skills practice as homework to fill maybe a learning gap that one or more students have in your classroom. This can really help students learn maybe a prerequisite skill that they haven't already mastered, and it helps you not sort of impact the rest of the class if it's sort of a small subset of students. The other thing would be for enrichment, right, as a supplement. So if you have a student or a group of students who are performing above grade level, maybe the content doesn't feel challenging enough for them, you can assign this as sort of an extra add-on to what they're already doing, either to take home or during class. So that they can continue to be challenged and focused and engaged.
So how does the new skills platform embrace the, or does the new skills platform embrace the same technology or theory?
Yes, in short. So the biggest difference between our skills platform and our traditional lessons is that the skills platform is skills based and it's focused on application. So rather than focusing on remembering and understanding concepts, the skills platform is focused on actively applying knowledge to perform a specific task. So this could be something like balancing a chemical equation, analyzing a primary source in history, really getting students applying their knowledge rather than sort of regurgitating things. Skills has three components that complement and work together. So the first is our bite-sized lessons and videos. And these are really introducing students to the skill, telling them what it is and what context it's used, tying it to previous skills that they may have learned, and then walking through example problems step by step so that they can see how they're solved. And then the skills video, similarly, it's a sort of tutorial style, usually on a whiteboard. So having an instructor put a problem on the screen or a scenario on the screen, and then walking through step by step with the student how it works. And then the third component is that practice component. So getting students actively involved, practicing on these specific skills. So all of these are really working together to help students master particular skills that are needed in a subject. And they all have those sort of components of microlearning, or those aspects and characteristics of microlearning. They're bite-sized. The lessons are usually about 500 words. The videos are anywhere from 2 to 7 minutes, just depending on the complexity of the skill. We have some AP Physics skills where they are sort of on the heavier 7-minute side to walk through a couple example problems, but some of the lower level math skills can be as little as 2 to 3 minutes. They're granular, again, very hyper-focused on a specific skill, but even kind of like a specific sub-skill within a skill. I won't pretend to know math, but there are different types of equations, and our skills can focus in on just one type that a student may be struggling with. And then finally, they're modular again. So really allowing for that maximum flexibility for teachers. They can assign a single skill. They can assign related skills together if you want to do some mixed practice or interleaving, having your students understand when is it appropriate to use which skill in the context. So yeah, again, absolutely using some of those micro-learning techniques with the skills platform.
It's fabulous. And I wanted to just share with our audience who might not be familiar with Study.com that we do have our microlearning curriculum offers all subjects. No matter what you teach, we do have content for you. So if you haven't already explored it, please reach out to one of us for that. And at this point, I'd love to go into the Q&A piece. And learn a little bit more about what our audience is asking. So if you haven't already posted a question in the Q&A, I've seen a few come in, so I'll ask those questions, but please keep the questions coming into that Q&A and we'll make sure that we ask Dr. Brockbauer those questions before you go. So the first one is, does microlearning work for any type of student?
Yes, it does. So what the science tells us, right, what we know from cognitivism and how the brain works, we are receiving information, we're encoding it, we're retrieving it in the same ways, whether we are very small or whether we're an adult. So the brain's working in the same way, which means that microlearning really will work for any age group. I think the key here, though, can be context, right, of how we're presenting the microlearning, the things that surround it. Those will be the things that change depending on the type of student. But otherwise, absolutely works for any type.
Fabulous. Does microlearning apply equally to all grade levels, or is there evidence that it applies more specifically to high school versus middle school?
Again, I would say it definitely has a broad application. Doesn't matter the grade level or the subject even. What I will say, and I think this is veering slightly, but I think is an important thing to note, is depending on what the student needs to be able to do at the end of the learning experience, how thoroughly they maybe need to apply a skill, engage with content, that's going to require more repetition and sort of additional microlearning that's linked together, if that makes sense. So something very simple that a student might need to do could probably be addressed through one microlearning experience. But if they're going to, let's say, need to be able to analyze a primary source, and they're going to be able to need to analyze any primary source you throw at them, let's say for US history, that is a skill that they're going to need to practice over and over in different contexts through different microlearning experiences. So it wouldn't be something where we would say, they can go all the way to evaluation, even though they've only, done like identification previously. So that would be my kind of caveat there is, yeah, they're going to need to engage with it in a way that's more critical, that's using sort of higher tier skills. They'll need to go just beyond an initial microlearning experience.
Wonderful. Thank you for the explanation. How do you see the future of microlearning, especially as technology exponentially expands?
So I think one thing is microlearning becoming more interactive. We're definitely seeing a shift away from sort of passive sort of watching of a video or reading of a text, but microlearning that has more sort of walkthrough elements, that has interactions with it, especially that kind of pause for students to engage. So maybe you give them a little chunk of information and then you have a question that pops up that says, what do you think about this? Or how could you see this applied in your own life? It can be something rhetorical. It can be that they do a writing exercise. It can be that they actually interact and engage with the online experience. But having that interaction, I think, is something that we're seeing just across the board in education technology, with sort of online learning in the classroom, but definitely with microlearning as well, is making those experiences not just didactic, but also interactive.
And I would say that our skills is kind of the first step to that on our platform, but it'll be interesting to see how technology adapts over the next couple of years. Another question I have for you is, does microlearning offer learners opportunities for practice, feedback, and reflection?
Great question. I think, yeah, it really ties into this this previous one. So it definitely can. It doesn't by definition, does it? No. But I think that we can craft great microlearning experiences that do have practice embedded in them. One of the things that we've done with the skills product is as a student answers a question, right, to practice on a skill, they're getting immediate feedback in that practice format of one, not just did they get it right or not, but also what are the steps to solve it? So you can have sort of an answer explanation where you walk through step by step. Okay, step one, here was the way to start to break down the problem. You know, did you do that? Step two, you can have things like hints. This is something that we're really thinking about here with the skills product, are how can we support students who maybe can do part of a skill but aren't able to do it totally on their own. So sort of the way a tutor would, right? Where you would encourage them to start to try to answer the question, and then you would figure out where they're getting stuck, and you would give a little bit of support, not too much, you wouldn't answer it for them, but you would get them to that next step. So microlearning can absolutely do those things of having them practice, giving them feedback, and then giving them support as well.
Fabulous. I have another question here. How can Study.com be used for students who are functioning below grade level?
That is a great question. So like I mentioned earlier, Study can definitely be used for what I would say are sort of prerequisite skills that maybe would be pre the current grade level for those kind of remediation, and it can really target where the learning gaps are. So if you have, let's say, an entire class that has similar learning gaps, absolutely can go in and use content from previous grade levels, look into those prerequisite skills, or if a portion of your class has a learning gap or a skills gap that you're needing to fill, you can also target that. And in particular, through the skills experience, through those kind of online classrooms that Study.com offers, you can assign them particular lessons that are relevant to them, but also particular skills practice that would be most relevant to whatever gap you're seeing.
So within the same classroom on Study.com, you're able to target certain students with particular lessons that are directed at their gap, while the rest of the class might be moving forward or doing some more enrichment on that topic.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So how can microlearning be collaborative?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I think this is one of those things where teachers can think creatively about how might you have your student, let's say, watch a microlearning video on a topic, and then how might that be the starting point for something like a class discussion, a small group discussion, a series of activities, question and answer, things like quiz party that we have at Study.com. So sort of a real small experience with questions that are out to the whole group of students. They get very competitive and really like things that are sort of games. So all of those ways, I think that microlearning can be used as essentially a stimulus for a larger activity that you do as a group that is collaborative.
I love that. Personally, again, as a teacher, those were my favorite activities to get the kids to work together. So it's great to see that you can use it, even though it's technology, it can still be used in a collaborative way. How did Study make the leap of using microlearning, seeing how it was successful in the professional world, to creating microlessons for K through 12?
Yeah, so one of really the first things that we thought about at Study is with making education accessible. What did that mean, right? So it can be financially accessible, it can be accessible through sort of anywhere, anytime, right? That it can be asynchronous, but also accessibility in sort of a psychological way and also in a cognitive way. And so one of the things that we were thinking about was making learning approachable by making it clear and by not causing confusion and overwhelm. And so that was really the reason why we decided to do these bite-sized lessons, is we wanted students and teachers to feel that the content was approachable. You weren't looking at just this huge textbook of like, how am I going to do all of this? But it was really small lessons back to back, that you can do, that you can space out, that the teacher can decide what piece does the learner need to be consuming these. So definitely part of our larger project to really make education accessible.
Thank you so much. You've done such a great job answering all these questions and giving content. We have about a minute left. So before we go, I just want to say that we have an exciting webinar in a couple of weeks, Demystifying Social Emotional Learning, with Megan Brown on October 26th. So we hope that you all can join us. And we're also going to throw up a final poll on your way out if you are interested in an evaluation trial of Study.com so you can see firsthand. Please let us know, reach out to your partnership specialist or manager, or you can send me an email. I'm happy to answer those questions and direct you in the right way. So again, once again, thank you so much, Dr. Brockbauer, for joining us today, sharing your knowledge, and it has been a great experience. We hope to see you guys on the 26th.